Laura stood on the fringes of the Halloween party, her eyes sweeping across the crowds. People in bright costumes danced, laughed, and posed for pictures, their exaggerated expressions and flashy outfits making her own costume feel small, almost invisible. She had spent hours planning her look. She'd gone for a subtle, classic vampire costume, hoping for something elegant but not over the top. Yet no one seemed to care, not even to notice. Her lips pressed together as she saw a group of girls glancing her way. She tried to ignore them, but their muffled giggles soon grew louder, cutting through the loud music. Before she knew it, they were standing in front of her. "Wow, look at this influencer," one girl sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Cute outfit. Did you get it from the bargain bin?" The others burst out laughing, and Laura felt her cheeks burn. She forced a tight smile, trying not to let it show that their words cut deep. But as the laughter echoed around her, more people turned to look, some chuckling and whispering to each other. Humiliated, Laura turned on her heel and walked away, pushing through the crowd. She could still hear snickers behind her, each one like a little jab. She didn't stop until she was out of the park and away from the noise, breathing in the cold night air. A heavy feeling settled in her chest, and she wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller than ever. Why did she even bother coming? She could have stayed home, done something she actually enjoyed. At least making reels would have been better than this disaster of a night. Lost in her thoughts, Laura barely noticed someone running toward her. Before she could react, a man barreled straight into her, knocking her off her feet. She landed on the ground with a thud, and a moment later, he was kneeling beside her. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he said, eyes wide with worry. "Are you okay? I didn't see you." Laura blinked, momentarily stunned, then looked up to see a young man with messy hair and an apologetic smile. She managed a small laugh, waving off his concerns. "It's fine, really." "No, seriously, that was completely my fault," he insisted, extending a hand to help her up. "I was running because, well, you probably won't believe me, but I thought I saw this huge creature or something in the forest. Freaked me out." Laura raised an eyebrow. "A huge creature? In the forest? Are you sure?" He laughed nervously, scratching the back of his head. "I know, it sounds crazy, but I swear I saw something big, like way bigger than any animal should be around here." She studied him, intrigued. His face was honest, his dark eyes glinting in the dim streetlights. There was something about him that was different from most people she met. Then his expression shifted. "Wait, I think I know you," he said, peering at her more closely. "You're that social media influencer, right? I've seen your reels." Laura's face lit up in surprise. "You? You actually know my work?" "Yeah, I do. They're awesome. You're really good," he said, his smile warm and genuine. A wave of happiness washed over her, erasing the bitterness from the party. She wasn't just a nobody here. He knew her. He appreciated her work. It was a tiny victory, but it meant the world to her. "I'm David, by the way," he said, holding out his hand again, this time with a grin. "Laura," she replied, shaking his hand, feeling her own smile growing. "Nice to meet you." "So I'm heading home now," David said, still grinning. "I live on Jerry Street. You?" Laura's eyes widened. "No way. I live there too." David's eyebrows shot up. "Well then, looks like I get to walk home with a social media star. Lucky me." Laura chuckled, feeling a spark of joy she hadn't felt all night. Together, they started down the quiet street, and she felt a strange comfort in the way he walked beside her, like they'd known each other for longer than just a few minutes. As they strolled, she felt the night settle around them, softer now, less lonely. But then she heard it. A faint, low howl that seemed to echo from somewhere in the distance. She stopped, turning her head. Did you hear that? David looked at her with a slight frown, his expression a mix of curiosity and amusement. Hear what? There was a sound, like something howling. David chuckled, his eyes twinkling. Are you trying to scare me, Laura? She shook her head. No, I'm serious. I heard something. He smirked, crossing his arms. Sure. Maybe it was the same huge creature I saw earlier? Laura rolled her eyes, realizing he was teasing her. Fine. Forget I said anything. David shrugged, grinning, and the moment of tension melted into laughter. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached her building, and she turned to him with a shy smile. Thanks for walking with me, David. It was nice. Likewise, he replied. It's not every night you get to meet someone as cool as you, Laura. She felt her cheeks warm again as she watched him walk away. As soon as she got inside, she hurried to her window, hoping to catch one last glimpse of him. But he was already gone, as if he'd vanished into the night. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Back already? Laura turned to see her flatmate, Daisy, standing in the doorway with a curious expression. Yeah, Laura said, the earlier sting returning to her voice. The party was awful. Some girls made fun of me and I just couldn't take it. I left. Daisy's expression softened. I'm sorry, Laura. People can be really awful sometimes. Why don't you rest? Laura nodded, the tiredness settling in as she thought about the night's events. She barely slept, her mind drifting between the memory of the insults and the unexpected kindness of a stranger named David. The next morning, as she stepped out into the pale light of dawn, she noticed a familiar figure walking toward her. Her heart skipped. David! He turned, looking surprised. Do I know you? She froze, feeling her stomach drop. Did he really not remember her? Then he broke into a grin. I'm kidding. I remember you, Laura. You looked so shocked for a second there. She laughed, the tension evaporating. That was mean, David. Hey, just trying to keep things interesting, he said, smirking. So, what are you up to this early? Just going for a walk, maybe make some reels, she replied, glancing around. I like the quiet in the morning. He nodded. Same here. I was actually thinking of heading back to that forest. You know, to see if my creature is real or just my imagination. Laura's eyes lit up. Can I come? It could make for an awesome reel. He grinned. Sure, but don't say I didn't warn you. This reel will be epic. They headed off together, laughter and conversation filling the quiet morning air. As they approached the edge of the forest, a faint breeze stirred the trees, their shadows dancing like ghosts. Laura's excitement was tinged with a strange curiosity. She wasn't sure what awaited them in those woods, but with David by her side, she felt ready for anything. The early morning sun cast a hazy light over the forest as Laura and David stepped inside, its shadows dancing like secrets along the ground. Right away, Laura sensed something different about this place. It was quieter than the rest of the town, the air heavier with a strange silence, broken only by the occasional whisper of leaves. This place, it feels different, Laura murmured, glancing around, her voice hushed as if she didn't want to disturb the quiet. David smirked, amused by her wonder. I warned you, didn't I? There's something odd about this forest. She laughed, but a slight unease settled within her as they walked deeper into the trees. David pulled out her phone and offered it to her. "Come on, let's get this reel going. You should capture the mystery of this place while it's still fresh." She took the phone, her hand steady as she aimed it at the towering trees around them. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. She moved slowly, capturing every angle, every quiet breath of wind in the trees. As she recorded, David came up beside her, peering over her shoulder. "And here we have the brave influencer, venturing into the wilderness," he said in a mock announcer voice, grinning. Laura chuckled, her cheeks warming. "If only my followers knew how terrifying this is in real life," she replied, playing along. But as she panned the camera over a moss-covered tree, something on the ground caught her attention. Her laughter faded, replaced by a frown. "Wait, David, look." They stepped closer, and her heart skipped a beat. There, imprinted in the soft earth, was a massive footprint, easily the size of a large animal. Her pulse quickened as she stared at it. A strange, clawed shape, unlike anything she'd ever seen. David's face grew serious as he examined the print. "See? I told you I wasn't imagining things. There's something big out here, Laura." She swallowed, lifting the phone again to capture the footprint. What do you think it is?" "I don't know," he replied, glancing around the trees. "But whatever it is, it's big." Laura hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she recorded the print. She felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement, fear of the unknown, yet excitement that this might be the breakthrough she needed for her social media. Should we leave?" David shook his head, though he kept his voice low. "We're safe, as long as we stay out of the dense parts. We're just getting started, right?" She managed a small smile, her courage bolstered by his confidence. "Right." They pressed on, though every step seemed to deepen the forest's eerie atmosphere. The light dimmed under the thick canopy, shadows stretching farther. Just as she was about to suggest they turn back, something else caught her eye. A dark red stain smeared across the bark of a large tree. "David," she whispered, pointing. He followed her gaze, his expression darkening. "That looks like blood." She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking between the stain and the shadows beyond. It was real. The danger was real, yet somehow she couldn't stop filming. "I think maybe it's time we go." David didn't argue. "Yeah, let's get out of here." They turned back, retracing their steps until the forest finally gave way to open air. Laura exhaled in relief as they emerged, the tension lifting like a weight from her shoulders. Just across the street, a small coffee shop beckoned with warm lights and the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee. Once inside, they settled into a quiet corner. Laura's hands moved instinctively over her phone, editing the footage, piecing together a short reel that captured just enough of the forest's mystery without revealing everything. When she added the caption, "Friends, tell me what is this?" she felt a thrill run through her, imagining the reactions. She hit post and set her phone down, her eyes drifting to David. "So, what do you do, David?" He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Honestly, right now I'm just trying to find my way. I'm between jobs, looking for something that feels right." She tilted her head, studying him. "What kind of job are you hoping to find?" He chuckled, his gaze distant. "Something that doesn't trap me in an office all day. I want to feel free, you know?" She nodded, understanding. They slipped into easy conversation, sharing stories and laughter until the tension from the forest faded. By the time they left the cafe, Laura felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. When she arrived home, she bought herself a sandwich to go and kicked off her shoes, ready to unwind. But as she took her first bite, her phone buzzed. A new notification popped up, and she froze, nearly dropping her sandwich when she saw the numbers. Her reel had reached 5,000 views. "Wait, what?" she whispered, clicking on the notification. Comments flooded the screen, scrolling faster than she could read. "This might be a tiger," one person wrote. "Looks like a prank to me," another commented. "Definitely a wolf," someone else chimed in. The speculations piled up and she grinned, hardly able to believe it. And then she saw a comment from David. "Can we have the next post related to this?" His comment alone had 800 likes, and it made her heart skip. He was part of this journey now, in more ways than she'd expected. Her excitement only grew as she checked her follower count. It had jumped from a humble 300 to over 2,000. She felt like she was floating, her mind racing with possibilities. But as much as she was drawn to return to the forest, a sense of unease lingered. Is it even safe? She wondered aloud. The footage from the forest was chilling, and she knew that going back could be dangerous. But the allure of fame was powerful, and she found herself weighing the risk. She spent hours researching, reading through stories and rumors about the forest. Reports varied wildly. Some claimed there were wild animals that prowled only at night. Others whispered of shadowy creatures seen only by moonlight. One old woman even insisted there was a tiger deep within, while others spoke of wolves and foxes, creatures that seemed both real and fantastical. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. It was David, replying to her earlier message. "Yes, we should actually. 4 p.m. near the coffee shop?" Excitement bubbled up in her as she typed back her confirmation. She took a quick bath, carefully selected an outfit, and packed her gear, determined to make the most of this opportunity. For extra precaution, she called a few local guards to accompany them, and they agreed. When she arrived at the cafe at 3:50 p.m., David was already waiting, leaning against a lamppost with a grin on his face. "You said 4 p.m., she teased, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged, smiling. "I was too excited to wait. Can you blame me?" She laughed, her heart lifting. "Yeah, me too." They started toward the forest, the guards joining them along the way. Laura felt reassured by their presence, but as they entered the trees once more, the sense of mystery returned. She began shooting, capturing the guards' careful movements and David's quiet focus. One of the guards stopped, pointing toward the ground. "Look," he said, his voice grim. Lying in the underbrush was the limp, mangled body of a fox, its fur matted and its eyes dull. It looked as though something had attacked it, half of its body gnawed away. Laura's stomach twisted, and she fought back a wave of nausea. "We need to leave," one guard said firmly, meeting her gaze. "It's not safe here." She nodded, and they quickly made their way back to the edge of the forest. Her excitement had faded, replaced by a sense of dread that lingered even as they left the trees behind. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "How about some dinner? We could both use a distraction after that." She managed a small smile, nodding. "Yeah, I'd like that." They exchanged numbers and Laura returned home, eager to edit the footage. She worked quickly, piecing together another reel, and posted it on her social media before sinking into her chair, exhausted yet exhilarated. When she checked her first post from the morning, she could hardly believe her eyes. 100,000 views. She jumped up, her laughter echoing through the apartment as she dashed to find Daisy. "Daisy!" she called, her voice bright with excitement. "My post! It's blowing up! I have 2,000 followers already, and it's still climbing. Daisy beamed, sharing in her joy. Laura, that's amazing. You're finally getting the recognition you deserve. Laura spent the evening glued to her phone, watching her follower count climb higher and higher. By the time she checked her second post, it had already reached 150,000 views, and her follower count had doubled again to 5,000. Her dreams were coming true before her eyes, yet a quiet voice in her mind reminded her of the danger that lurked in that forest. A reminder chimed on her phone, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was 8 p.m., and she was meeting David at 9. She hurried to get ready, carefully styling her hair and applying a touch of makeup, eager to see him again. When she arrived at the restaurant, he was already waiting, flashing a grin that made her heart flutter. Laura, he greeted her, his voice warm. She smiled, crossing her arms playfully. David, you're always early. He chuckled, leaning in. What can I say? I have a beautiful girl to impress. She laughed, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. Well, mission accomplished. They found a cozy table by the window, and as they ordered, David couldn't resist cracking a few jokes, his stories so vivid and funny that she found herself laughing harder than she had in ages. For a little while, she forgot the forest, the mystery, the thrill of going viral. All of it melted away in the warmth of his company. When their food arrived, he watched her as she took a bite. So, Miss Famous, how does it feel? She shrugged, feigning modesty. Oh, you know, it's all because of you, she said, her tone teasing. He smirked, leaning in with a playful glint in his eyes. Then I'll just have to stick around, won't I? Keep the luck going. She laughed, her eyes bright with excitement. I'd like that, David. I really would. As the night wore on, they spoke of everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears in the warm glow of the restaurant. Laura knew that danger waited for her back in that forest, yet with David by her side, she felt a courage she hadn't known before. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she would be returning to that forest soon. Laura's evening with David left her restless with excitement, despite the foreboding chill that came with her ambition. After they finished dinner, Laura hesitated before speaking. David, I know it's dangerous, she began, her eyes gleaming with determination, but I think I should go back there. I need something more for my reels. David studied her in silence, his brow furrowing slightly. Are you sure? She leaned forward, voice urgent. David, this could be my chance. If I want any real success, any chance of becoming a top influencer, I need something big, something people can't look away from. After a pause, David spoke. All right. But if we're going to do this, we need licensed forest guards with us. They're the only ones who know how to handle things out there. Laura felt her confidence waver for a moment. I don't know any licensed guards. David met her eyes, steady. I'll arrange it. That night, Laura returned to her apartment, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, a thrill running through her as she opened her social media app. Her second post had exploded with attention, over 250,000 views. Another 1,000 followers added to her count, bringing her total to a surreal 6,000. I have to go back, she whispered to herself, feeling both excitement and fear. She was scrolling through the comments, basking in the buzz her posts were generating, when her phone buzzed with a text. David. The guards have agreed. Laura exhaled, a rush of gratitude filling her. Thank you so much, she replied, feeling more reassured. Early the next morning, she called David, confirming their plan. Are you sure about the guards? She asked. Don't worry, he replied. They're licensed and prepared, and they've given us exactly 30 minutes. That should be enough, right? A surge of confidence ran through her. Definitely. 30 minutes is more than enough to get some solid shots. They set the plan. They would meet the guards and venture into the forest at 5 p.m., right as the evening shadows deepened. The idea of entering again was both terrifying and electrifying. That evening, as they reached the forest, the guards led the way, their eyes keen and focused, weapons at the ready. Laura felt safer with them around, their presence like a shield against the unknown dangers of the trees. She began shooting, aiming her camera through the canopy where light barely pierced the branches. David moved beside her, scanning the surroundings, while the guards watched their backs. But after nearly 30 minutes, they had found nothing out of the ordinary. No strange footprints, no eerie markings, no movement in the shadows. Laura's heart sank. She glanced at David, frustration seeping into her voice. "There's nothing here. Nothing that'll catch anyone's attention." David paused, considering her disappointment. "I have an idea. Don't post anything tonight. Instead, leave a comment on your last post saying, 'The next part is coming.' That way, we'll buy some time for the next shoot." Laura considered it and gave him a grateful smile. "And we'll have time to plan for something better." As they returned to the apartment, Laura's excitement faded, replaced by doubt and disappointment. Once inside, her flatmate, Daisy, noticed her mood and asked, "What happened? You look upset." "We found nothing," Laura replied with a sigh. "Nothing special enough for a reel." Daisy thought for a moment, then raised an eyebrow. "What if you shot it at night?" Laura stared at her, a mix of shock and curiosity. "Are you crazy? If any animal came out, we'd be attacked in an instant." "You don't have to go deep inside," Daisy replied, her tone practical. "Just bring a zoom lens and shoot from the entrance." The idea seemed wild, yet intriguing. Laura's mind raced through the possibilities. "All right," she said finally. "You're right. It could be safer that way." Daisy smiled. "I'll go with you. And my boyfriend, Robert, will come too. It'll be safer with him there." When Laura texted David to ask if he'd join them at 1 a.m., he didn't respond. She glanced at the clock. Already past midnight. He was probably asleep. Laura felt a twinge of unease, knowing the risks of a night shoot. Turning to Daisy, she said, "Maybe we should call this off. What if something goes wrong?" But Daisy, sensing her friend's ambition, gave her a determined look. "We'll be fine. We're staying at the entrance. There's nothing dangerous about that." Laura knew Daisy was right. The desire for fame and success was too strong to ignore. She set up her gear, heart fluttering with anticipation. Shortly after 1 a.m., they made their way toward the forest, Robert carrying the zoom lens. Daisy turned to him with a smile. "Got the lens?" "Right here," Robert replied, handing it over to Laura. She thanked him, attaching the lens to her professional camera, her fingers steadying as she adjusted the settings. When they reached the forest entrance, they exchanged a look, each one making sure the others were ready. Laura positioned her camera on a low tripod, carefully setting it just above the ground to capture every detail. She added her phone to a secondary stand, ensuring she'd get multiple angles of anything that moved. As they spoke in low voices, Robert began to recount local legends about the forest. "There are rumors about this place," he murmured, casting a wary glance toward the trees. "Stories of creatures, things people only whisper about." Laura's pulse quickened, and she pressed her eye to the camera, adjusting the zoom. Suddenly, a faint howl echoed from deep within the woods. The sound was low, almost mournful, sending a chill down her spine. She quickly rotated the camera, trying to find the source. And then she saw it. Through the dense trees, at a distance of maybe 150 or 200 meters, a massive, shadowy figure moved. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she focused the lens, heart racing as the figure took shape. It was a werewolf, a hulking creature covered in thick fur, with gleaming eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It moved with a predatory grace, and in its jaws, a struggling cat dangled, its eyes wide with terror. Laura's fingers fumbled on the camera, desperate to capture the moment. But the creature was fast, vanishing into the shadows with a speed that defied logic. She only managed to catch a glimpse, but it was enough. A blurred frame, a fleeting image of something monstrous. Beside her, Daisy whispered, "Did you see that?" Robert's face was pale, his voice unsteady. "That wasn't real, was it?" Before Laura could respond, another sound echoed through the trees. A low, menacing growl, closer this time, maybe 30 or 40 meters away. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, a primal fear seizing her. "We have to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without packing her equipment, Laura grabbed her phone and camera, and the three of them sprinted toward the street, their footsteps pounding in the stillness of the night. They were so close, only about 30 meters from the safety of the streetlights, when Robert stumbled, tripping over a hidden stone. Daisy kept running, but Laura turned back, her voice tight with fear. "Robert, hurry!" But before he could respond, a shadow moved, a blur of motion so fast it was nearly invisible. The werewolf lunged from the darkness, its claws slashing across Robert's chest with terrifying precision. Laura's stomach twisted in horror as she watched, frozen in place. The creature struck again, its powerful jaws clamping down on Robert like he was nothing more than a rag doll. And then, in a flash, it was gone, retreating into the shadows with Robert's lifeless form in tow. Laura's hands trembled, and for a moment, she felt as though the world had stopped. She could hardly breathe. The image of Robert's terrified face burned into her memory. "Laura!" Daisy's voice called out, jolting her back to reality. Daisy was already near the street, looking back with a frantic expression. Without a word, Laura forced herself to run, barely aware of her surroundings. When they finally reached the apartment, Daisy's face was ashen, her voice shaking. "Where's Robert?" she asked, eyes wide with fear. Laura felt a lump rise in her throat. I don't know. The creature. It took him." Daisy's scream shattered the silence, tears streaming down her face. "It's all my fault. I shouldn't have suggested we go." Laura tried to comfort her, voice soft and strained. "Maybe he's alive. The police might find him." But even as she said the words, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. She knew the chances of Robert's survival were slim. Laura stared at Daisy, her own shock dulling the edges of her emotions as she registered Daisy's grief. Every word felt sharp, piercing the air, cutting into her sense of reality. "It's my fault," Daisy choked out, her voice thick with guilt. I made him come with us. I thought he'd keep us safe." "Daisy," Laura said, reaching out but unable to find the right words. Maybe he's still out there. We'll call the police. They'll find him. He could be alive." Daisy collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Laura sat beside her, feeling Daisy's shuddering breaths against her own shoulder. She wanted to believe her own words, but the memory of Robert's limp body in the werewolf's jaws was seared into her mind. Laura's phone buzzed, snapping her from the dreadful silence. She blinked at the screen, which showed a notification from her social media app. One message in particular stood out. "When's the next part coming? We're all waiting." For a moment, the absurdity of it all made her want to laugh. a hollow, bitter sound. While they were barely escaping with their lives, people on the internet were eagerly awaiting more content. She glanced at her camera, the images she'd captured still fresh in her mind, and knew the video of that horrifying night could go viral. It was exactly what she'd been hoping for in some twisted way. "What do I even do?" she whispered, almost to herself. Daisy looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "You're asking me? After all that just happened? You can't be serious." But Laura was already opening her camera roll, her hands moving almost on their own. She started editing, piecing together the footage of the creature's shadow, the blur of its movements. She knew this video would haunt her, and yet, the thought of the attention it would bring drowned her guilt in a strange, numb excitement. Daisy was watching her in disbelief. "Laura, don't post it. Don't you see what this is doing to us?" Laura hesitated, torn between Daisy's plea and her own ambition. But then her fingers moved, hitting post, before she could talk herself out of it. Daisy shook her head, tears welling up again as she picked up her phone and dialed the police. She explained the situation as best as she could between sobs, telling them about the creature that took Robert. Within half an hour, the police arrived, their faces grim as they listened to Laura and Daisy's account. They didn't hide their disapproval of the girl's decision to enter the forest at night, especially after the previous warnings. The police officers asked Laura to show them the footage, and as she hesitantly held out her phone, they stared at the brief but unmistakable image of the werewolf. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, confirming what Laura and Daisy already knew. This wasn't some random animal attack. There was something real, something monstrous lurking in the forest. One of the officers cleared his throat. "We'll go out there with backup, but neither of you are coming with us." They quickly organized a search team, bringing in additional officers and backup vehicles. Laura's heart pounded as she watched the police convoy drive toward the forest, their headlights fading into the darkness. As the silence settled over the apartment, Laura finally called David, her fingers fumbling with the phone. He didn't pick up, and she sank down onto the couch, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. An hour later, a call came from the police. They had found Robert. Daisy nearly collapsed with relief, and they rushed to the hospital to meet the officers. Robert's parents were already there, their faces pale and drawn. When Laura and Daisy arrived, his mother's eyes flashed with anger. "This is your fault," she spat, her voice shaking. "You two dragged him into this madness. If he doesn't make it, it's on you." The weight of guilt crushed Laura, but she didn't have the words to respond. She couldn't escape the image of Robert's terrified face, the creature's claws slashing through the darkness. She lowered her head, letting the accusations wash over her, feeling each one as a deserved punishment. As they waited, the doctor finally came out. His expression was grave, but he assured them, "Robert is stable for now. He's been through a severe trauma, but physically he'll recover. We'll keep him overnight for observation." Relief flooded through them, though Daisy's eyes remained troubled. Laura took her seat, staring at her phone screen as notifications poured in. Her latest post had gone viral, hitting over 1 million views within minutes. The followers were pouring in by the thousands, and comments filled the screen, each one asking for more details, demanding the full story. Despite the horror of the night, Laura felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was what she'd dreamed of: fame, recognition. But now it came with a weight, a cost she hadn't anticipated. She glanced at Daisy, who was still shaken, and swallowed hard, knowing she couldn't express her conflicted feelings here. Then, suddenly, the door to Robert's room opened, and a nurse emerged, her expression alarmed. "Doctor," she said urgently, He's He's acting strangely. Laura and Daisy exchanged worried glances, and they, along with Robert's parents and the police officers, followed the doctor into the room. What they saw was beyond anything they'd imagined. Robert was crouched on the hospital bed, his body tense, his breathing ragged. His eyes were wild, darting around the room with a feral intensity. His hands clawed at the sheets, and as they watched, he let out a low, guttural growl, something that sounded more animal than human. "Robert," his mother whispered, stepping forward. He snarled, his eyes narrowing, a dangerous gleam in them that sent chills down Laura's spine. His teeth seemed sharper somehow, and there was blood on his lips, staining his mouth in a way that made her stomach turn. The doctor stepped closer, trying to calm him. "Robert, you're safe. You're in the hospital. Just breathe." But Robert's face twisted in a snarl, and he sprang from the bed, landing on the floor with an agility that seemed unnatural. His body tensed, coiled like a predator ready to strike. Everyone in the room froze, stunned by the transformation. Then, before anyone could react, Robert's eyes rolled back, his breath shallow, and he collapsed. Silence fell over the room as the doctor rushed to his side, checking for signs of life. After a moment, he looked up, his expression grave. "I'm sorry. He's gone." A strangled gasp escaped Daisy, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Robert's parents fell silent, their shock too deep for words, while Laura stood motionless, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Daisy's sobs filled the room, and Laura watched, feeling as though the world was spinning out of control. She wanted to scream, to cry, but the numbness in her chest held her back, trapping her in a cold, relentless silence. For the next few days, Laura couldn't shake the haunting image of Robert's final moments. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his wild gaze, the way he had snarled like an animal, the blood on his lips. Her social media continued to grow, her followers reaching new heights, her notifications nonstop. But every notification felt like a mockery, a twisted reminder of the price she'd paid for fame. Her social media continued to grow, her followers reaching new heights, her notifications nonstop. But every notification felt like a mockery, a twisted reminder of the price she'd paid for fame. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, her phone buzzed with another message. She looked down at it, her vision blurring. It was another comment on her post, someone asking for details about the werewolf sighting, demanding proof that it wasn't a hoax. Laura turned off her phone, her stomach churning. The fame she'd chased now felt empty, poisoned by everything she'd lost. She stared at the camera sitting on her desk, its lens still coated in dust from that fateful night. A thought crept into her mind, a vow she made to herself as she finally allowed herself to cry. "I'm done," she whispered, her voice raw. "I'll never go back to that forest again." But even as she said it, a dark voice lingered in the back of her mind, whispering of the fame she'd attained, of the mystery that still beckoned from within those trees. The chapter ends with Laura sitting in the dark, the weight of the night's horror settling over her like a heavy shroud, unsure if she would ever escape the pull of the forest, or the terrible creature that lurked within it. Laura's eyelids felt weighted down from exhaustion, and without realizing, she'd fallen into a fitful sleep. When she opened her eyes, her phone screen was softly glowing on her nightstand. She squinted, saw a message from David. "I'm sorry. I was sleeping." Without a moment's delay, she tapped to call him. When he answered, his voice was drowsy, but he quickly grew alert as she recounted every terrifying detail of the night. "Laura," he murmured, trying to control the frustration in his voice. You should never go into the forest like that. I told you how dangerous it is. It was just a few videos, she argued. They're making me famous, David. This could be my big break. David's tone sharpened. But at what cost? Last night could have ended. Much worse than it did. He let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of something he wasn't saying. There are things in that forest, Laura. Real dangers. Not just for you, but for Daisy. For Robert. She bit her lip, not wanting to admit that he was right. But David, she countered softly. You don't understand. The forest has a magic to it. I can feel it. And if I can capture that, people will notice me. They already are. David went quiet for a beat. Laura, did you see anything else out there last night? She hesitated, the memory of the werewolf flashing vividly in her mind. Yes, I did. I saw something. Something big. What did you see? His voice was low and tense. A werewolf, she whispered. I got it on camera. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was a mix of disbelief and something else, a strange, unreadable emotion. You actually saw it? Not just saw it, filmed it. She half expected him to be excited, but instead his voice filled with a quiet urgency. Laura, you have to delete that footage. Immediately. She frowned, frustrated that he didn't understand. I already posted it. It's gone viral. He sucked in a breath. Laura, this isn't a game. That creature. You have no idea what you're dealing with. They met at the coffee shop later that morning, their conversation turning tense and strained. Laura tried to defend her actions, and David tried, in vain, to make her understand the danger she was putting herself in. Eventually, he raised his voice, desperation bleeding through. You're playing with something far more dangerous than you can imagine, he pleaded. Please, for your own safety, stop this. But Laura was relentless, and when she stood to leave, she could barely look him in the eye. She returned to her flat, her mind a whirl of emotions and questions. Daisy wasn't there, and a pang of worry tugged at her. She tried calling her friend, but it went to voicemail. Perhaps she'd gone out to clear her head after last night. Just then, her phone buzzed again. A notification from her social media app. She had reached 10,000 followers, the number climbing by the second. Each new follower was a confirmation of her success, a sign that she was on the right path. But mingled with her excitement was a strange pang of guilt. David's warning echoed in her mind, but she pushed it away. As the hours ticked by, the desire to return to the forest grew stronger. She considered calling David for help, but she knew he'd only try to stop her. She called the guards instead, arranging for them to meet her at the forest's edge the following morning. And so, as dawn broke, Laura found herself standing at the forest entrance, the guards by her side. She checked her equipment, made sure her camera had a full battery, and then, with one final breath, she led them in. The trees loomed around them, and every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen threats. They moved deeper, and soon enough, one of the guards called out. Laura turned to see him gesturing at the base of a tree, where dark red stains splattered the roots, a gruesome reminder of last night's horror. She snapped a few photos, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. It's time to go back, David's voice cut in suddenly. He was standing a few paces away, having arrived without her noticing. His face was lined with worry, but his jaw was set with determination. You've got your footage. Let's leave. Laura bristled but relented, allowing him to guide her and the guards back toward the edge. Just as they neared the boundary, a rustle in the grass froze them in their tracks. Laura held her breath, eyes fixed on the bushes as they shivered and parted. Out leapt a rabbit, bounding harmlessly into the underbrush. They all let out a collective breath, chuckling nervously, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Back at her flat, Laura found herself alone with David. As they ate a quiet lunch together, David did his best to draw her attention away from the forest, telling funny stories and making her laugh. For a few precious hours, she almost forgot about her obsession with the werewolf footage. As they talked, a warmth settled over her. She looked at him, realizing how much he truly cared. She felt herself drawn to him, leaning closer, their faces mere inches apart. David's eyes flickered, and he leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek. Without thinking, she pressed her lips to his, feeling an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. The moment shattered as her phone chimed again. She glanced at the screen. Her follower count had soared to 15,000, and the werewolf video had reached over 2 million views. David sighed. Maybe it's time to step back from this, Laura. Just for a while. But she shook her head, the thrill of her success too intoxicating to ignore. David's expression fell, and he tried once more to convince her to abandon her dangerous pursuits. Their conversation grew heated, and when he raised his voice, begging her to stop, she turned away and left. That night, her mind was a battleground. The memory of David's words haunted her, but so did the call of the forest, her desire to capture something no one else had dared to. In the early hours, she made her decision. She gathered her equipment and set out alone, slipping into the night like a shadow. Laura hesitated at the forest's edge, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. A low growl rolled through the night, distant yet unmistakable, setting her on edge. Shadows thickened under the moonlight, swallowing up the path she had walked so many times before. With trembling fingers, she adjusted the camera, zooming in to capture whatever was out there. She scanned the dense thicket, her vision darting between the branches and the spaces between. Then, her camera focused on something massive and still. A werewolf. Towering, muscle-bound, covered in dark, bristling fur, it stood just within the line of trees, watching her. Her breath stalled as the creature's eyes locked onto hers, glinting with an unsettling awareness, almost as if it recognized her. Its gaze was as intense as it was unreadable, a stare that seemed to pin her to the ground. In those eyes, she saw both a warning and a promise of something far darker if she didn't heed it. Without thinking, Laura turned and ran. Her apartment was only 800 meters away, but with each step, her fear grew sharper. She barely heard her own footsteps over the pounding of her pulse. Then came a howl, loud and furious, cutting through the night like a warning siren, echoing off the buildings and filling her with dread. As she fled, the crunch of leaves and snapping twigs trailed close behind. The beast was moving faster than she was, each of its strides impossibly long and powerful. A shudder ran through her, but she pushed herself harder, desperate to make it home. Then, just as she reached the final stretch, she felt a blinding pain shoot through her thigh. She stumbled, falling to her knees, feeling the sting of her torn skin where the werewolf's claws had grazed her. She was bleeding, her vision blurring from pain, yet she forced herself forward, clawing at the earth as she dragged herself closer to safety. The werewolf appeared beside her, its massive form blotting out the moonlight. Its growl was low, almost as if it was speaking to her, not in aggression, but as a clear, unbreakable warning. Laura's breath caught. It wasn't trying to kill her. It was holding back, restrained, as though it understood her, perhaps even recognized her. But before she could fully process this, the beast moved away, only to be replaced by two smaller figures emerging from the shadows. These were wolves, but smaller, leaner, their eyes burning with a wild, predatory hunger. They lunged at her, claws extended, fangs gleaming. Laura braced herself, but before they could reach her, the larger werewolf sprang between them, tackling the smaller creatures with ferocious speed. It was a brutal clash of teeth and claws, fur flying in all directions as the three beasts grappled for dominance. Shaken and overwhelmed, Laura took her chance to crawl away, inching toward the distant lights of her apartment complex. She could still hear the snarling and snapping behind her, a vicious symphony of violence. Her vision began to blur from the pain and blood loss, but she refused to stop. Just as she was about to collapse, red and blue lights filled her field of view. A police car had pulled up, and officers were shouting. They barely paused before opening fire, the gunshots ringing out, echoing off the trees and cutting through the dark. The werewolves fell one by one, their bodies crashing to the ground in heavy thuds. Laura watched, helpless, as the larger werewolf, the one who had saved her, collapsed last. She knew with a terrible certainty that it had been protecting her all along. Laura woke in the hospital, the sterile white walls a sharp contrast to the dark memories replaying in her mind. Her leg was bandaged, the pain dulled but constant, a reminder of how close she'd come to something far worse. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the footage she had managed to capture. She couldn't delete it. Despite the horror, she knew it was the most incredible footage she'd ever recorded. But as she uploaded it, there was no thrill, no excitement, only a hollow ache, the realization that her drive for fame had come at a terrible cost. The posts went live, the views piling up faster than she'd ever seen. But it all felt empty now. Her heart felt heavier than ever as she thought of David. She called him, leaving voicemails, sending messages, but there was no answer. The emptiness grew, settling like a weight on her chest. The following day, Laura mustered the strength to visit David's house, only to find an ambulance and a group of police officers outside. She felt her stomach twist as she saw a stretcher, and on it, a figure she recognized immediately. "David!" She pushed through the officers, her voice cracking with panic. "What happened?" An officer explained. "We found him just outside the forest, heavily wounded. Wolves must have gotten to him." Her mind reeled. She knew the truth. David had been the werewolf, the one who had saved her, fought for her, and nearly died for her. Without waiting, she rushed to the hospital, desperate to see him. David lay on the hospital bed, pale and weak, his eyes closed as though he were at peace. But when he heard her voice, he opened his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of pain and resignation. "David." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" He sighed, looking away for a moment before he spoke. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to look at me like you're looking at me now." Laura felt tears sting her eyes. "David, I still love you. None of this changes how I feel." David's expression softened, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I warned you, Laura. I told you to stay away, but you didn't listen. And now I've lost everything." A heavy silence settled between them. "I have to leave, Laura," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now that they know, the others will come. They'll hunt us all down if I stay." She shook her head, her voice pleading. "David, please don't leave. I don't care about the risks. We can find a way." But he shook his head firmly. "This is my life, Laura. I can't change it. And I can't ask you to live in constant fear." He paused, looking at her with a bittersweet smile. "You'll be safer without me." Laura reached out, her fingers brushing his, but he pulled away gently. "You need to let go. Find someone who can give you the life you deserve. Not this." His voice cracked as he said, "Not this curse." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat as David's eyes fluttered closed. She watched as he drifted back to sleep, his breathing shallow and strained. When she returned with a doctor, his bed was empty. David was gone. Laura returned to her apartment, her mind reeling with the finality of it all. Her fame, her followers, the countless views on her posts. All of it felt hollow now, mere distractions from the aching void left by David's departure. As the days passed, she kept scrolling through her page, seeing the likes, the comments, the messages from her fans. But it all seemed meaningless. The forest, once a source of thrill and excitement, was now tainted with memories of loss and regret.